Figment is a small indie action puzzle and somewhat musical game that came out in 2017 with the somewhat unique premise of playing within someone's subconscious, kinda like Psychonauts, except you're playing as an already inhabitant of the mind. But before we get into the story, I just want to talk a bit about the situation I found myself in to play this game, as I recently received 3 months of Stadia Pro through some giveaway. And this was one of those quote unquote free games that comes with a service. Well, at least it was free for me. And I wanted to try a smaller game to see if the service worked well before I delved into something like a 40-hour RPG or something. And I will say that on that front, it worked well. It's not flawless, but I will address that more in the graphics a little bit for people who might be considering playing this version as well, especially if they are in a similar situation to me. So it's really nothing deep. I played this game because it was free and short enough for me to not feel bad if the service I used to play it died on me or something like that. Now, to get back to the story, as I said before, you play inside the mind of a man as a character that already existed within that mind. Our main character is then Dusty, an old imaginary friend from the person whose mind we're exploring, who is propped back to action after some sort of accident has happened in the outside world, leading to negative changes in this world as well, as it's overrun by monsters and other evil characters that in a lot of ways seem to be deteriorating the world. And being that this game takes place in the mind, a big part of it is allegories for mental health and even physical health to an extent. For example, Dusty seems to represent bravery and determination, and at the beginning of the game he's just lazy and to an extent forgotten, and has to get back to his former self, which I think is an interesting dynamic. And overall, the game's thematic and ideas are very cool, but I do have my problems. My first one is the writing. A lot of the dialogue just felt awkward, and especially from the antagonists as they spewed their evil monologues, and then the game just kinda went, well, moving on. Even the dialogue between the main character and Piper, another character that will accompany you throughout the game, making the dialogue between these two the most common one in the game. And well, it's also awkward. Most of their dialogue is either them insulting each other or making some really bad jokes/puns. I know that jokes can be subjective, but I don't think what is here is gonna be funny to many people. It's mostly just lowbrow puns. It's not the worst video game writing, but it feels especially worse when the concept of the plot is so interesting. And that also leads us to my other problem, that is where the story goes. Throughout the game there will be several hints, both visual and audible, to what's going on in the outside world, and that's cool, but what that eventually ends up leading to plot-wise, not so much. The fact that the theory I had in my head felt like a more interesting or even emotional ending, and I'm not a game writer. Now, it's hard to talk about this without spoiling, but I feel the revelation this game leads to diminishes a lot of the points the game had been making up until that point, and recontextualized them in a way that felt a whole lot less interesting to me. Now, that's not to say that the story is nonsensical or even bad, but on a personal level, given the topics the game was dealing with and the path it chose, came off to me like the easy way out rather than the interesting one. But you might not think that when you play it. And overall, it's not a bad story at all. And moving on then to the gameplay. And this is unfortunately by far the weakest bit of the whole game, basically mixing action and puzzling with a bigger focus on the puzzling bit, which is good because the combat here honestly sucks. It's very basic, as you have one dodge and one attack, and later on you do get a charge attack that is mostly for puzzles and not very useful in combat. And that by itself wouldn't be a problem, especially since it focuses more on puzzles, but the combat is also just so floaty feeling, and that and the really bad hitboxes and those two together make for a really bad experience, which is a shame because there is some really nice enemy variety here, with enemies like spiders that need to be attacked after they're defeated so they don't come back to life, or lizards that spit some sort of acid with different firing rates or patterns depending on their color, and even the boss fights are rather creative, but again, all of that gets brought down by the bad game feel of the actual combat. But thankfully, to some extent, it's also just very easy. In fact, I mostly died in puzzles. You just have a lot of health, and health is the only thing you can upgrade throughout the game as you collect white orbs, and that's all fine and all, but the game really could have gone away without using them at all. Your health regenerates to a certain extent, but then there's also green orbs, which you probably guess give you health. These things aren't bad, but they just feel somewhat useless, which again is made worse by the bad combat. Now, talking about the puzzles, they mostly work in the way of get item that opens a certain area, and that area will have another item, and then you'll have to manage those items to in some way create a full path to your destination. It is a bit hard to explain through text, but hopefully the gameplay will give you a basic idea. Now, these types of puzzles are fine enough, and there's even a nice level of satisfaction when solving them, especially harder puzzles, but that's also a problem here as there really never felt like there was any difficulty progression aside from the tutorials. Most puzzles in this game seem to be on very similar level of difficulty, which makes for a game that becomes a bit tedious as you progress, because you're not really being challenged, and in my experience it actually started to feel very repetitive. Adding to the tedium though is also how these puzzles are laid out. Often you have to run back and forth multiple times from one side of the level to another to reorganize items and move pathways and things of the sort, and it's just very tedious. Sometimes I would figure out the solution for one of the puzzles and just have the feeling of dread because of all the walking around I knew I would have to do. Honestly, while these aren't bad puzzles, this would fit a more traditional puzzle game format where you can just see the whole level and move stuff around with the mouse or something a lot better, because it would just flow a lot faster, which honestly this game needs, even while being already a very short game. And the game being short does make me think that this type of design was purposeful, either for padding or just telling the story, which either way isn't particularly good. And there is more adding to this slowness, as animations for puzzles felt to me dreadfully slow. Every time you activate or deactivate anything, you get locked into having to watch the full animation play out, which is not out of the ordinary, but because this game already feels so slow, this does make it feel like it's dragging here. And this is not even the worst offender, as hands down, the worst part of this game is pushing boxes around, and how slow it is to do that. It really is the epitome of this game's problem, as not only it is slow to move them just by themselves, but it's also a big part of the puzzles that you'll have to do it while going back and forth throughout the levels to reach different sides of these blocks, so you can move them around in different directions. It is tedious to a fault, sadly, but also it's short enough that I didn't give up on it, and the story is still strong enough to push me through this about 3-hour game. Now let's end this bit and talk about graphics. The world design itself is very nice. There are various different themes to each area of the subconscious, and each here are very colorful while still being very distinct from each other. And of course there's also that sense of you fixing these locations as you go in there and it's all destroyed or run down, and through your actions and puzzles getting it back working again in some way. And overall that's all really good. My only small nitpick is purely from the character design, because while they're not ugly, they just did not appeal to me. And I think a big part of it is because they just don't really emote at all, and I was not a big fan of that. They just kind of stand around with their faces. Now, speaking in more technical terms of playing the game on Stadia, well, it ran well, but I can't help but feel like I'm playing a YouTube video, because while the game may be running at 4K or in my case 1440p, it is still compressed for streaming, and that by itself is fine since I expect the game to have some compression, being that it's been streamed and all, and there's no noticeable input delay, to be fair. And also, I'm not about to look a horse in its mouth, but something I can't complain about is pixelation and color issues, bringing it back to that YouTube video feel, as it's that type of glitches you would see on a YouTube video where part of the image gets really pixelated and or the color is displayed wrong, like you might notice in this video. Some of areas of the screen are just blobs of yellow, which is very distracting, and this is usually an issue with the compression. Thankfully it didn't happen too much, but I will say when it starts happening, you should just restart the game. Which in this game, while still an annoyance, because it's always an annoyance to restart a game, but less of a problem here since it has very forgiving checkpoints. Now, to finish this off, let's talk about the soundtrack. The music in this game itself is fine, there's not much to say there. Where I do think it gets a bit weird is in the songs that are sung by characters. It's just, again, awkward. No offense to the voice actors of this game, but they're not particularly amazing singers. And adding to that, it's just, again, awkward writing from the game that extends to these songs. And these musical bits of the game feel so unnecessary every time it happens. It's just like it comes out of nowhere. It's not like the music in the rest of the game is a standout, like I said. It's just okay. Or at least that was my experience. And overall, my experience with this game was I wanted to like this game. It had such a cool idea going for it, but at every stop this game makes a decision that I feel makes the experience worse. But it's still not a bad game, and when you look at the whole package, it does almost make up for a lot of its problems. And I think maybe for you it will, but for me, I'm giving Figment a 5 out of 10. It was almost a 6, but I think I just finished this game with a sour taste in my mouth and I couldn't bring myself to give it that score, as this game has a lot of core problems, much like DC Superhero Girls, for example, another game I reviewed on this channel with some janky combat and other problems. But when I finished that game, I felt like I had enjoyed my experience despite the problems. While here, I already ended the game in a bad mood, and the more I thought about it, the less I enjoyed it. And this is also the part of the video where I have to tell you that a 5 out of 10 is not a bad score. It's the middle score. It's something that is neither bad nor good, and I think that maybe you might find something in it that I didn't. So let's talk about recommendations wise. Well, if you have like me the opportunity to play it for free, then yeah, sure, try it out, as the story and its writing might just work for you better than they did for me. But if you're paying for it, then only if it's really cheap, as it's also a very short game and I don't think it's worth the $20 base price. But thankfully it's also rarely at that price, so whatever. Regardless of your decision then, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing and even commenting, all things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope that you're having a good day, and goodbye.